morning I want to focus on three areas. There are many areas that we could consider when we think about how is the church affecting and changing, as it were, life on the street. We could think about the entertainments of the ancient world, all kinds of institutions and so on. But the three that I'd like to bring out and more or less highlight for our present discussion would be, one, the institution of slavery; two, the institution of the family; and three, the whole idea of the institution of public entertainment, particularly the gladiatory, or the gladiatorial games, gladiators and so on, those contests. Those three areas. As I say, that's not an exhaustive list. There are many other areas we could look at. Some are fascinating, and even what we're going to do this morning is only a cursory, summary kind of effort to look at some of these, but I hope that it will at least give us some idea of how this story should be told. So with that, I'd like to take up, first of all, the whole question of slavery. We alluded to it last week, but let's focus on it somewhat more at this point. I think you're aware, and we pointed out last week, that more than half the population in the 2nd and 3rd centuries were slaves. This was an economy that was based on the practice of slavery, and the institution of slavery was foundational to the whole life of the ancient economy. Slavery was common, it was unquestioned, and even by the most enlightened thinkers of the ancient world, even the Platos and the Aristotles and the Senecas and the great thinkers of the ancient world, slavery was taken for granted. It was almost inconceivable to the ancient mind that you could have life without slavery. And so let's just try to imagine, if we can, a deeply entrenched institution taken for granted, which, of course, from our point of view, we may find an abhorrent idea, but nevertheless, if we can get back inside the skin of the ancient person and realize that that was more or less the way things were viewed. The condition, of course, of slaves in that setting was not good. The church historian Kenneth Scott Latteretz, who, by the way, has written a wonderful 2-volume series on church history, and I've had a few people ask, is there anything that could be read along with this series of lectures that might give a little bit more breadth as we go along? And my first recommendation would be that series, or that 2-volume set, which, as I understand, you can pick up for $20, both volumes, from christianbooks.com, and they ran a special on it not long ago. I think it's still readily available. Kenneth Scott Latteretz, Latourettte. And so you could read along comfortably, keeping pace with our movement in the class, and you'd find that that would be helpful. But anyway, he says concerning the condition of slaves in the ancient world, quote, "The lot of slaves was often unhappy, and public opinion condoned the use of the lash on them, the killing of them when their usefulness was past, and the selling of them at low price when they became old." And he goes on to quite an extended discussion, but just to give you the flavor, this was true slavery. This was a situation in which the people who were engaged in that level of social status had no inherent rights. Indeed, the whole idea of people having a kind of natural right to life or to the kinds of things we take for granted would be foreign to the ancient world. They would read a statement like we make in the Declaration of Independence. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That would be a non sequitur to the ancient mind. What's this, endowed with inalienable rights? What sort of nonsense is that, you see? But to the ancient mind, that was exactly the way things were. And so that's the culture in which Christianity begins to meet the world. What did Christianity do about slavery? Directly? Nothing. There was no organized effort, no kind of campaign, no political efforts to somehow dismantle the institution of slavery. In fact, I have to say to you that one of the most common criticisms that people make along these lines of the New Testament is that it doesn't condemn slavery. Paul writes to slaves and tells them, be obedient to your masters. He writes to Philemon, who was a slave owner, concerning a runaway slave, Onesimus, says, receive this one back as a slave. Now, Paul gives some other suggestions as well concerning how this Onesimus should be treated. But the point is, he doesn't say to Philemon, okay, now look here, Philemon, you're a Christian, and it's ungodly and immoral for you to own slaves. Therefore, I command you in the name of Christ as an apostle to release this man. He doesn't do that, you see. He appeals to him as a brother in terms of godly treatment of this man and his possible liberation, but he doesn't demand it, nor does he ever, nor does the Bible ever condemn slavery. And people have looked at that and said, well, look, see how backwards and, how completely distorted the Bible is because it doesn't condemn slavery. Well, that has to be said. That has to be granted. So in fairness and in honesty, I would say that. Nevertheless, I think it's also fair to say, and it's been pointed out many times by historians, that the seeds of the destruction of slavery were obviously and clearly planted by the Christian gospel. The gospel doesn't do its business by simply identifying every social ill that could be ticked off in some kind of laundry list and then beginning to systematically just attack them as such. That's not the way of the gospel. But what the gospel does is plant within human life and human society those basal principles which, if they grow naturally, will inevitably undermine and destroy the godless institutions that were otherwise taken for granted. That's exactly the kind of thing that I think we'd say took place with slavery. And I'd like to suggest to you at least 3 reasons why the philosophy of Christianity was hostile to and ultimately destructive of the practice of slavery. It took time. This didn't happen overnight. Indeed, in the entire 200-year period we're discussing, slavery was not eradicated by any means. It continued all during this period, but nevertheless undermining the entire institution were certain principles that spun out of the Christian understanding of things. The first of which was that people before God are equal. We talked about that last week, that there is an equivalent dignity that all people share, that regardless of your status in life, whether you're wealthy or not so wealthy, whether you're male or female, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're beautiful or ugly, whether you're smart or dumb, whatever classification may concern you, it doesn't matter before God. That all of us stand on an equal turf, as it were, before God. And you begin getting that idea into people's minds, and institutions like slavery begin to be threatened. A second little piece of the puzzle that helps to explain what happened, and this is another one that's a little deeper even, is that Christianity attaches dignity to work. That is to say, work is itself a sacred thing. This, again, was a foreign notion in the ancient world. There was an idea that there is some work that is absolutely beneath the dignity of some people. You see. They just won't stoop to do it because it's beneath what anybody with any self-respect would do. Christianity comes along and says to people, as you labor, labor as unto Christ. This work that you're doing, don't conceive of it simply as an activity that you're doing at the level of human relationships, but view this service that you're offering as nothing less than service to Christ himself. So don't serve simply with what Paul calls eye service. That is the kind of thing that you do when people are watching, But it's as if Christ is watching you all the time. This is a fundamental idea within Christian thought. It goes way back to the Old Testament, clear back to the creation narratives, that work has dignity. Probably there's no Christian society in history that elevated that to a higher status or a more refined understanding than the Puritans. And we still hear to this day of the Puritan work ethic. Where did that come from? It came from the idea that your vocation is sacred. Whether your vocation is a plumber or a preacher, sacred. Whether you're a carpenter or whether you can spontaneously think of a few others. Whatever it might be, I will hazard to say even a lawyer, but some of you doubt that. But nevertheless, all work, all vocations, you see, have this dignity before God. And there is a sense in which we can all bring in the proper sense of the word a kind of pride before God to our labor. Well, when you begin to have even slaves thinking that way, the institutions of slavery begin to crumble slightly, because that's not the way that labor is viewed in a slave economy. Another little piece of the puzzle was that the Christian theology began to redefine the categories of freedom and bondage. Even in the New Testament we find that. Paul writes, for example, to slaves that even if you are a slave, in Christ you are free. And by the same token, a person who may be a free man, a citizen of Rome, may be very much a slave in the true realities of life, a slave to sin, a slave, you see, to things that are debilitating and destructive. And that it's only in Christ that true freedom is acquired. So, for example, Tertullian, who's writing roughly in the early 200s, gives us this statement, very typical of the way in which Christian commentators discuss slavery. Notice how he doesn't attack it. He doesn't say, abolish slavery, nothing like that. That didn't come so much later. But listen how he begins to redefine the understanding of these notions of slavery. Quote, this is Tertullian. Quote, how can the world make a slave free? All is mere show in the world. Nothing is truth. For the slave is already free as a purchase of Christ, and the freed man is a slave of Christ. If you take the freedom which the world can give for true freedom, you have thereby become again the slave of man. You've lost the freedom of Christ in that you think it bondage. This is a typical kind of critique that would be brought to bear. And it began to cause people once again to rethink the nature of life, the nature of work, the nature of those social categories. Another interesting thing, as I think mentioned last week, was that many, maybe most of the early converts to Christianity were slaves. Not too surprising, because slaves made up most of the population, and Christianity tended to be absorbed by these lower classes of people. They embraced it gladly. They made it part of their life and outlook and so on. But of course, the very fact that Christian people who were slaves were being converted to Christ tended to transform their behavior. And as a practical matter, one of the most interesting stories we see in church history is how people who had been slaves, and if you know anything about slaves, they have a reputation of not being highly motivated to work. You have to kind of keep the whip to them. All of a sudden they came to faith, and they became these incredibly productive laborers. And the only thing that had changed was their faith. And there are multiple stories of how people who were slave owners were so impressed with the change in the life of their slaves that they began to inquire, how do I count for this? You used to just be lazy. Now you're diligent. Now you're productive. I don't have to keep watching you. You keep working even when I'm not monitoring your behavior. What's going on? And the slave would account of the whole transformation to Jesus. And there are many accounts of slave owners coming to faith through the testimony of their own slaves. And in fact, some remarkable stories of how on various Easters, this was usually when it would happen, on Easters there'd be a special celebration in which slave owners would announce the emancipation of their own slaves, because they in fact had come to Christ and, touched at the point of their conscience, believed that it was no longer appropriate to maintain that kind of relationship. No armed rebellion, no, kind of taking on the institution in some sort of violent overthrow of this godless thing, nothing like that at all, but simply the gradual growth of the inevitable implications of the Christian gospel having its effect during this period of time. It's really a remarkable thing. What we do see during this 200 or so years, though we don't see slavery abolished officially in Rome until later, but what we do see is that gradually legislation goes into effect. The general kind of critical mass of public opinion changes as a result of the Christian influence, and there become to be laws that restrict the way in which slaves might be abused, the way in which slavery can be conducted, and so on. And you begin to see that kind of thing happening gradually. Slaves within the church were not given any restriction whatsoever. In fact, many times slaves, oddly enough, held high positions of ecclesiastical office, higher in authority than their slave than the man that owned them. You see, and you get that kind of deal, where a slave would be a bishop and nevertheless have within his congregation the very person that owned him as a slave. That kind of irony would take place occasionally. There's one account, in fact, one individual that actually ascended to the position of the chair of Peter in Rome, had started off in life as a slave. He's counted as one of the popes in the chain of popes in the Roman Church in the mid-200s. So really, I think you could say the first really idea of kind of social mobility came through the church. It was the church that began to open the possibility for people who were at the very lowest level of the human social order to move up to some of the very highest levels, and that could not help but begin to influence what happened in the world around them as well. The first time that we have truly in church history an actual condemning of slavery as an institution is not until Augustine and his mentor Ambrose, and that takes place in the late 4th century, the late 300s. And so what I'm saying is slavery takes all of this eroding effect of Christianity without one occasion where it was actually, as it were, directly condemned by the Christian witness. It was just a gradual influence over those years. So anyway, let's leave that. The second area that I'd like to talk about briefly is family. Family. This one is tougher than slavery, and so I'm going to do the best that I know how to do here, but there are loose ends on this one. But I think we again see the basic theme playing out in an interesting kind of way. First of all, it needs to be pointed out and kept clearly in mind that in the ancient world, the family was the possession of the state. Again, even in the most enlightened thinkers, Plato's Republic makes this very clear. Aristotle never does anything to change it. The great thinkers in Greco-Roman culture generally all took it for granted that the family is at the pleasure of the state. The state has precedence over the family in every respect. This is, if I can use this expression, the village with a vengeance here. You see, this was the state really owning everything. The children, all of those things that we would consider part of what is sacredly the family. The marriage itself had no particular moral character. It was viewed more as a contract between a man and a woman. Now you have some idea occasionally of affection, and certain letters and so on that have come down to us certainly reflect that. But in terms of an institution, it doesn't have a moral content to it as such. Corollary to that was that it was women in the ancient world were of course viewed as having not much more than a slave status. And this was part of the whole view of marriage, that really women functioned as a kind of a necessary convenience in the married relationship. They had certain roles to play and certain tasks to perform, but there was no dignity that was inherently attached to women as such. And really the husband in the relationship had a kind of transcendent authority there that extended way beyond anything we might otherwise consider even remotely appropriate under the most patriarchal kinds of categories. It was worse than that, you see, in terms of what was commonly practiced. The thing that strikes me as a little ironic is I've heard it many times, probably you have too, I've heard the critique brought to bear that Christianity is somehow hostile to the dignity of women. You know, I've heard that. I've heard the New Testament somehow reduces the status of women. And so I'm going to just say to you, that is absolutely nonsense. That is the most unbelievable misrepresentation of the facts I could conceive of. You will find no religion in the history of the world that has been more devoted to elevating the status of women than Christianity. You don't believe it, just go to a Hindu country, go to an Islamic country, for goodness sakes. I mean, it's Christianity, you see, that has brought women into the position of having the right to own property or to vote or, those kinds of things. And to try to ascribe the change in the status of women to other classic sources than Christianity would be a hopelessly impossible task. But in any event, in the early church, what the church found in culture was women basically as chattel. They were property, they were beasts of burden, they were convenience for men. There was a double standard with a vengeance, in that world between the status of men and the status of women. Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, has great discussion of this. I'll just give you one representative sample. Quote, referring to women, "Her husband or master was invested with the plenitude of paternal power. By his judgment or caprice, her behavior was approved or censured or chastised. He exercised the jurisdiction of life and death. And it was allowed that in the cases of adultery or drunkenness, the sentence of death might be properly afflicted. She acquired and inherited for the sole profit of her Lord." And so clearly was woman defined not as a person but as a thing, that if the original title were deficient, he might claim her as property along with his other movables for an entire year. And he goes into a whole discussion of what that means. But you can get the flavor of it, that women were basically property. They didn't own anything, they were owned. And that was their only status in life. Well, what did the Christian church do in that regard? I might say, by the way, one thing in favor of the Roman world is that monogamy was the rule. They didn't practice polygamy. That's to be said to their credit. However, footnote, concubinage was common. And so even though a man could only have one wife, he could have multiple concubines, and adultery was common for men, but punishable by death for women. So like I say, there was quite a double standard going on there in favor of the male of the species. Another little point is that a similar kind of analysis would apply to children. Children were mere property. If a child was born into a family and they didn't like the color of the eyes, the child was somehow not healthy or not what they wanted, there was absolutely no criminal content whatsoever to just simply leaving the child to die of exposure. This was clearly practiced. Infanticide, abortion were absolutely common in the ancient world. In fact, the Christian church, this is one point where the church did take a rather definitive stand very early. The Didache, which was a little Christian handbook of Christian practice, published about 105 to 110 AD, very early, which was like a little primer for Christian converts, gave, it was maybe 100 pages long and just gave some basic instructions concerning how Christian people behave, and explicitly denies that a Christian could ever be involved in either infanticide or abortion, that both of those were viewed as unchristian practices, and so that kind of fits into the same scheme there as well. Another common and widespread practice in the ancient world, which tended to reduce the status of the family, was the very widespread practice of pedophilia and homosexuality, which again Gibbon in his Decline and Fall gives lengthy discussion of. But the necessary consequence of that was, of course, that again the dignity that was associated to the family as such was greatly diminished, because in a sense sexual pleasure was found to take place in other areas. Well, how does the church respond to that? I'd like to say to you, well, the church immediately recognized all these evils and began to have family life conferences here and there around the ancient world to rehabilitate immediately the family and show how the family is supposed to be. Didn't happen. That's not what happened. I think what you'd have to say, in fairness, is that in a sense the church was so impressed with how distorted the institution of the family had become, how far there had been a deviation, you might say, from any kind of biblical norm or pattern for family that you could conceivably imagine, that in a sense the church overreacted. In a sense, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if I can use that happy expression. And what happened was that the church began to elevate and really place a high degree of priority on the radically celibate life. Virginity began to be elevated much higher than the married life. And I have to say, I think what this was almost a kind of purging moment in the history of the church. In a sense, before you could start trying to rebuild an idea of family, it was in a sense necessary to just clean the decks entirely. And so while there were many Christian families, the church nevertheless really elevated, I would say inappropriately, the status of virginity, and people who just absolutely abstained from any kind of sexual relationship whatsoever, kind of overdoing it to cure this ill. Now, there's other reasons for that. The whole Platonic influence of body and soul is part of the story there that I'm not getting into. But just as a practical matter, that seems to be what was happening. Nevertheless, by a later time, we do begin to see a new understanding and a better understanding of the status of the family coming in. But during these 200 years, there's not a whole lot to be said about it. But there is a lot to be said about the radical transformation that took place with respect to the status of women. Women were emancipated within Christian understanding from the bondage of social oppression in the ancient world. They became some of the greatest examples and indeed heroines of Christian courage and virtue. And there are many stories that come out of the early church's pages which talk about women heroically giving themselves in martyrdom and in other forms of service, which really became a great example of life on the church and the great contribution the church was making. There's one heathen commentator, Libanius, a Roman, who quips in one famous quote, "What women have these Christians?" as he looked at the Christian culture of women and saw the virtue and the heroism and the strength of character and the service that they provided, and how there was a complete transformation of the whole understanding of womanhood within the Christian culture. That was the comment that was made. A later commentator, Augustine, really begins to reflect the transformation of the view of women during that time. This is a famous quote. It's attributed to Augustine. I think it probably comes from Augustine, but it's a debated point. But traditionally it's been ascribed to Augustine. You've probably heard it. Quote, "Eve was not taken from the feet of Adam to be his slave, nor from his head to be his ruler, but from his side to be his beloved partner." You see, that's where the view was going. From woman being an absolute slave on the one hand, a mere chattel, to one that was a beloved partner of a man in a married state, becomes the model that we eventually see in Christian tradition. So anyway, so much for that one. Again, that's a complex point, but hopefully that gives you some food for thought there. Finally, the whole institution of public entertainments is another area where you don't see the church doing a broadside assault, but just gradually there is an effect that takes place, just an inevitable, necessary consequence that occurs by virtue of the presence of the church in the public square. I mentioned to you last week that public entertainment had really reached levels of incredible degeneracy. Not only the gladiator games and contests, but just entertainment generally. They had the ancient equivalent of X-rated theaters you see on every corner, only in their cases they actually had people up there doing this stuff for the purposes of pure entertainment. That was very, very common. Of course, the most famous, the most popular, and the most inhumane of all of this was the raw violence and bloodshed that we associate with the games that took place, the gladiator games. Again, Gibbon gives us a great quote. If you don't mind me just quoting him at this point, I think it gives us something of the flavor of how this was viewed. He says, quote, "The impatient crowd rushed at the dawn of day to secure their places, and there were many who passed sleepless and anxious nights in the adjacent porticos. From the morning to the evening, careless of the sun or of the rain, the spectators, who sometimes amounted to the number of 400,000, remained in eager attention, their eyes fixed on the horses and charioteers, their minds agitated with hope and fear for the success of the colors that they espoused. And the happiness and success of Rome appeared to hang on the event. The same immoderate ardor inspired their clamors and their applause as often as they were entertained with the hunting of wild beasts and the various modes of theatrical representation." First time I read that, it reminded me of when Star Wars came out, you know. All these people lined up for blocks all night long, all-night vigils, to wait and see Star Wars. But in any event, we have a whole culture that was kind of given over to its entertainments. And the superficiality that came along with that, of any deep ethic or any deep moral fiber, was simply eroded and destroyed by this just completely insatiable quest to simply be one more time entertained and prodded in the numbness and the bankruptcy that life had become at that time. It is interesting that it was only the Christian church that raised a voice of protest against the gladiator games. Only Christianity was the source of any kind of criticism. Christians took vows when they joined the church during this period that as a consequence of their converting to Christ, they would no longer attend the public theater or the gladiatorial contests, that was simply off limits for them, of course, unless they were drugged there to be part of the entertainment themselves. Christianity at first only had a moral effect on these games, but again, it's been pointed out that by the 4th century, you begin to see a true undermining of the popularity of the games, so that even though they were still attended by that period, nevertheless, the way in which the games were conducted and the very popularity of them have been seriously undermined. There is a story that comes out of church history that is possibly legendary. It seems to have its roots in fact, but whether the precise details are accurate is one of those things that we'll always wonder about. But it probably at least happened, or something like it happened. There was a monk who was named Telemachus, Telemachus, who had a burning, passionate concern for the ongoing gladiator contests. And in fact, on one occasion in Rome, when the crowds had gathered and they were clamoring for the beginning of the games, he, a monk, walked down onto the field between two either gladiators or factions of gladiators that were about to come at each other. And he stood in the middle of this field, as the story goes, and raised his hands like this, as if in a combination of prayer to God and at the same time kind of like the ultimate referee to keep these two parties apart in the name of Christianity and common decency, to stop this bloodthirsty kind of entertainment. And one of the gladiators, seeing him, pulled out his sword, walked over and cut him down so that he gave his life and died right there in the middle of the arena. And yet, as an immediate consequence of that, the whole crowd, in a kind of embarrassed awe, just got up and began to trickle out. So that within about a half an hour, the place was empty. And somehow the conscience of Christianity had even touched paganism to the point that it was beginning to be nauseated by its own fascination with gratuitous violence. Now, whether or not that happened quite that way, as I say, is an open question, but that is reputed to be the last game, the last gladiatorial event of ancient Rome, and took place sometime in the early 300s. It has the ring of truth to it. It may be a compilation of a variety of stories, but nevertheless, that certainly, at least figuratively, is exactly what was going on, that the Christian church was simply raising increasingly a protest against this inhumane and outrageous practice that was liquidating thousands of lives a month when it was in its height. The historian Lecky, L-E-C-K-Y, in his work History of European Morality, who's not writing necessarily at all from a Christian perspective, simply as a historian, makes the following statement, quote, "There is scarcely any other single reform so important in the moral history of mankind as the suppression of the gladiatorial shows. And this feat must be almost exclusively ascribed to the Christian church. When we remember how extremely few of the best and greatest men of Roman world had absolutely condemned the games of the amphitheater, it is impossible to regard without the deepest admiration the unwavering and uncompromising consistency of the patristic denunciations." That is, when you look at how infrequently the best minds of paganism ever raised even a whimper of protest to the gladiator games, it's a remarkable thing that really from the very earliest beginnings of Christianity vis-a-vis paganism, those particular shows were coming under the critical review of the patristics, that is, the early fathers of the church. And so again, I think that gives us a great encouragement to see how the church, even though it wasn't necessarily in some kind of organized campaign trying to dismantle these particular practices, nevertheless, over the period of time, was highly successful in undoing them. So that by the time we get to the year 300 to 325, it's safe to say that this despised, this illegal, this kind of nondescript little cult that came wandering out of Israel and was just treated like a bunch of people that were just idiots, morons, buffoons, not to be taken seriously. That little group had so invaded and infiltrated culture that it was hardly recognizable as the same culture it had been only 200 years or so down the road. I'd like to wrap up this little segment by giving you another great quote from Lucian, who's not a Christian, a Roman commentator, who really, I think, puts his finger on what was at the core of the great influence that the Christian church was having, and he's observing the evident love that Christian people had for one another. Jesus said, "You will know they are Christians by their love." And here's a wonderful testimony from a pagan of that very point, when he says, quote, "It is incredible to see the ardor with which the people of that religion help each other in their wants. They spare nothing. Their first legislator has put it into their heads that they are all brethren." What a thing. Their first legislator has somehow gotten it into their heads that they are brethren. Don't they know about a stratified society? Don't they know that there's free and there's slave? Don't they know that there's all kinds of distinctions we have to make among ourselves? No. Somehow Jesus got into their skull that we, regardless of social station, are brothers and sisters in Christ. And that really did become one of the great transforming effects of the Christian faith during that period. Next, I'm going to stop here. I'll just tell you, next week we're going to shift our focus to the problems inside. And I think you'll find that that's an interesting story of how the church, trying to come to terms with her understanding of Christ vis-a-vis the assaults that gave rise to some interesting heresies and deviations along the way,